senior tower, in other words, shorter and taller. The hard to house is in the base of the junior tower. That tower is all market housing. When you actually come from this street, the condition is a flat iron condition, so it's quite a striking condition. That's one of those examples of a terminated view that we stress. So when you're coming down that street, it terminates on the flat iron condition of that tower. London Drugs, which for you in America is a drug slash appliance slash electronics general store. Very big and a very important anchor tenant. And Nestor's, which is normally a high-end grocery store. And when they announced that it was going to be a high-end grocery store, the community went nuts. I remember that morning when I was getting the calls. And I called the developer, and the developer agreed to insist that they have portions of their stock-keeping units that were more affordable. So they brought the price point down significantly. But it was kind of a dumb move to lease to them in the first place, in this context. But these two anchor tenants, critically important, and had to be kept in like a herd of cats with the university campus too, because it seemed like as this was being planned, my friend who is the project manager of this, almost every week he was having to convince one of them not to pull out, and the house of cards falling down. This is what I mean by I'm not sure we could replicate this. But it was necessary for all these pieces. There's city-owned space. We took space. The Downtown Eastside planning team, the social housing team, the cultural team is in here. All three levels of government here. So there's office, retail, and there's housing. So all of these, this public space, part of the public benefit package. It was a requirement. I joke the architect gets a huge amount of credit for this space, but it was required of the design. He actually had to do it. And some of the details are actually sometimes criticized as being a bit heavy. But the theory was that this is the weather protected inside area, that's the exterior area. This space is very well used. It's the living room kind of for the neighborhood. You can see it's permeable, lots of ways to come in and out. The basketball is almost constantly used. If they haven't programmed sort of 3-on-3 tournaments, there's almost always people using it. And then the other things like the pianos and such. So it's a very informal space, but very successful on a day-to-day basis is my observation. And I live in the neighborhood, so I'm always seeing it. You're gonna ask about the photo. Does anyone know who Stan Douglas is? I'm surprised. He's probably the most famous visual artist, photographer on the planet right now. And a lot of people don't know he's Canadian, from Vancouver. That piece is about the Gastown riots. This was a recreation of probably the worst moment in the neighborhood's history in the, I think it was the 70s. That intersection doesn't exist anymore. It was recreated on a fairgrounds outside the central area meticulously. You can actually zero in on the photographs, and if you zoom in, there's an online version, you can zoom in, and the newspapers on the street are the newspapers from that day. It was a moment where the police took a very heavy-handed approach to the clearing of protesters, homeless protesters, and a riot, a level of riot, at least a Canadian version of a riot ensued. Well, if you want a real Canadian riot, you have to lose in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup to have a real riot. But that was obviously a critical riot in the social life of this neighborhood. And when I give people tours of this, the first line they almost always say is, why are you showing the worst moment in the neighborhood? And it's up there, isn't it vandalized and such? And they always say, we'd never do that in our city. And I always say, that's very much part of the Vancouver DNA, that we don't hide anything under the rug. It's sort of brought out and talked about as part of almost reconciliation and remembrance. And that thing has never been vandalized. It's never been tagged. It's never. I think the glass is pretty strong, but I don't think it's ever been attempted to be broken. You'll see it's on both sides, and as I say, it's the most famous artist in his medium. The developer that we ended up selling the land to is a very good developer who really believes in not only architecture but public art. He's a bit of a patron. So all of his projects have something substantial, but I think you would agree that goes well beyond anything he would have had to do in the context of a normal sort of public art program for the private sector. And it's remarkably brave. So you see all the elements sort of working together in here. And then we'll go outside, we'll go to that corner, and then we're pretty much going to be done with it. So if you have questions, actually let's stop for a minute. Do you have questions about this? What I say is whatever you think about the architecture, some people like it, some people don't. The architecture is not what's important. The building program, the things that are assembled here, doesn't exist anywhere else. I've never seen another example of this, and I've traveled a lot of cities in the world.
Was the riot kind of a catalyst for social change, like the Stonewall
It was one
riots
of the
or
catalysts.
something?
Actually, it's a good question. The riot predated another famous thing called Wood Squat, which actually was the catalyst for this. Woodward's is named after the famous grocery store, department store, grocery store. Woodward's, and almost every Vancouverite who was born and raised here has a story about going to Woodward's when they were kids, the food floor of Woodward's, smelling food and such. That is a replication of the famous W you can see up there. That's the iconic termination that you would see if you go to that corner. That's the original, you'll see the original W over there. We insisted that they keep it and put it in the public realm. The city did, but that was that's the new replication. After it closed, it was empty for a long time, and then Wood Squat happened. The homeless community squatted in here and refused to be moved, took over the building and refused to be moved for a long time until the province promised to build affordable social housing. And there were negotiations, and eventually they vacated. But it was through that whole exercise that the city, a particular counselor, a left-wing counselor named Jim Green, used it as a bit of leverage to negotiate the city's ability to be able to acquire the land, and that's what really got all this started. So that was the catalyst, whoever asked that question.
So I know you mentioned how many housing units and things like that, but from density per acreage?
We don't use density per acreage.
Okay.
No urban place should ever use density per acreage. We use FSR or FAR, floor space ratio.
Right.
It's high. I don't remember the number. It's over 5. It's probably somewhere between 5 and 7 FAR. But I was going to say one of the if we walked around the block, what you'd see, again, pop out quickly if you want to that entrance and just look at the other side of the street. At the time this was opened, and even I remember during the Olympics, there was an art installation during the Olympics in 2010 when we hosted the Winter Olympics along the entire upper floors of that block, because it was all boarded up and empty, that entire block, and it was all a multimedia activation of fire. And it was like a kind of a version of that, like you're showing an art piece that the block is on fire in the downtown east side. What are you asking for it? It was a very strange thing, but it was all done on a block. It was about tension and turmoil in a challenging community. That was what the art was supposed to be on. But that block was empty in 2010. Look at it now, and that's again in that direction, in that direction, in that direction. That block right there is the only corner that hasn't developed, and that's only because the developer had completely out of touch expectations of what he could build, and now he sold it and somebody else has got an application in. So this has been a powerful catalyst, and the thing I'll say is, even though the low-income community, to speak about equity and inclusion, even though the low-income community was a very key part of the negotiation of this place, had incredible access and influence over the negotiation of this place, including the 500 and 200, etc. A lot of those people that were either part of that negotiation or many of the people in the community that weren't, don't buy into this project. And so if you stopped an average person in this neighborhood on the street and asked them what they thought of Woodward's, they would either say it's the best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood or the worst thing that ever happened to this neighborhood, depending on their perspective of gentrification or how economically the $50 t-shirt shops are a result of it, etc., etc. So both very interesting, both very successful, and both also very polarizing. And in other ways, I won't say unsuccessful, because I do believe it's successful, but it has created the challenges of success. Anytime you actually improve a place, there are consequences to that for some people. And this is ground zero for the gentrification conversation in Vancouver.